There we go. So hi everyone, I'm Francesco Perticarari. I'm the general partner, founder of Silicon Roundabout Ventures, and invest in deep tech. And of course, deep tech includes topics like advanced algorithms and software, and as well as hardware. And of course, because of that, a lot of the companies we back come from either corporates or university spinouts. And so the process of spinning out, it's something that is quite core to what we see day in and day out in the firm. So from lab to market, well, the first reason is like why? Why even spin out a company from university or from a corporate? And here's why I think spinning out is not just something that we can do, but something that we must do. First of all, let's look at tech. So tech is now telling us that it's come twice full cycle around. If you look at venture and how startups, so to speak, have been progressing for the last 30, 40 years, from the early Silicon Valley boom days to, of course, the first mania of the 90s, then, of course, a big crash, then again another 20 years of bull cycle, building companies, creating more and more technologies, and then again a crash. If we look at what's happened through this time, we see that at every iteration of the cycle, there are new infrastructure technologies that back the build-up of this cycle. And so now that the applied tech, let's put it that way, boom is deflating, then really we should be asking ourselves, what are the new infrastructure technologies that will propel the next wave of technologies? Everybody's using the deep tech word, so let's use deep tech for simplicity, and again, let's include all novel technologies that require actual, genuine, novel IP to be commercialized for the company to make sense, just as a shorthand. And of course, if you think about all of these technologies, and we go from, of course, the AI world to the hardware world, that includes anything to do with detecting, potentially curing cancer and health, and of course supporting health progress, as well as changing the way we deal and produce and store energy, and of course food, and solve effectively the largest challenges that we face today. And here's why I think spinning out is critical, and not just something that we can do, but something that we ought to do. Because we can look at, for example, what happened in fusion, which is a very hot topic these days, and one of the most challenging to solve in terms of building a company that can support it. And we can look at, for instance, why examples like Commonwealth Fusion in the US or First Light Fusion in the UK, with tens or maybe a couple of hundreds of millions, have managed to achieve in about 10 years more than ITER in France has achieved in twice as much, with 20 billion. Now think about that. And you can see that across so many industries. It's just an example. Now, the reason, there is actually a Harvard research that shows that venture capital, so money spent by a company that is built to commercialize research, is 3 to 4 times more effective than the same amount of money invested by an academic institution or a corporation doing in-house innovation. Think about that, 3 to 4 times. And that's why, if you look at the history of technology and the history of venture, the modern history of venture capital, we realize that whenever we want to build technologies that are not just nice to have, taking advantage of a boom, but actually supporting and fueling the next wave of innovation, then actually spinning out technologies is critical to make sure that those technologies actually have an impact. And Europe is not actually that badly placed when it comes to potential. It's this fertile terrain where we are actually, including UK and EU together, surpassing the US and China in terms of most highly cited academic research, for instance, as well as now competing with China in terms of level of funding to deep tech areas. Now this is a nice starting point. Of course, there's more. There are also examples of companies that have made it. Everybody's familiar with BioNTech, I'm assuming? Yeah? You all? Who's familiar with BioNTech, what they do, right? If you all had a vaccine jab or tried to avoid the vaccine jab, whatever, you still had to basically deal with either them or another 2 companies. And of course, it's a lab spin-out that got all the way to being public now. We might be familiar with Oxford Nanopore in the UK and a bunch of other companies that now are either listed or at growth stage. And all these companies are examples that spin-out doesn't just need to be sold for a few tens of millions to a large corporates that might forget about the AP or internalize the AP for internal purposes, but that can actually go all the way to commercialize the AP to the point of being a market leader, like Darktrace, for example, in cybersecurity, selling to both US and European customers. And some universities, according to the statistics, again, in Europe, seem to be doing fine. We've got, Oxford, Cambridge, ETH in Zurich, that in terms of number of spinouts, they seem to be doing all right. The UK, Switzerland, Germany, they're all producing spinouts at an ever-increasing pace. So, you might be thinking, well, that's great. Spinouts is good. Spinouts are happening. What's not to like? Well, the reality is that it's not, unfortunately, a straightforward path. And so in today's workshop, I want to look at a little bit of a couple of potential tips I've seen experience from founders that have managed to spin out, at different ways in which you can commercialize technologies, or as investors, we might look at ways to back founders that are looking to commercialize technologies, because they're not all the same. It changes depending on whether you're looking to spin out from a corporate, from a university. We're going to mostly be focusing on universities, but a lot of it, I'm going to mention it actually applies to people that work at the larger corporates, and they think that actually the innovation they're developing could be better suited to launch as an independent company. So, long, twisted, expensive path. We know now, because there has been a massive survey comparing UK, European, US founders, that we're not doing that great in terms of founder satisfaction. And founder satisfaction is not just like, oh, it's nice to have. It's literally, some companies never manage to see the light of the day, or they have to take paths that ultimately jeopardize their long-term growth when trying to spin out their IP. Of course, again, it's a mixed bag, right? You've got universities like Cambridge and Zurich that seems to be doing a lot better than others, but then you've got other universities that are even getting negative points. I mean, we're literally saying universities or certain corporates are so unable to make spinouts that they make it almost impossible for founders to actually go and do it. And, obviously, if you look at the data from, spinout, FYI, you're starting to see things like time to spin out has completely killed the process, or the university was a terrible partner, and the experience was overall bad. Think about this, right? We've got the potential of curing diseases, of creating vaccines to the speed at what BioNTech enabled us to do, and yet these companies might never see the light of the sun, or might never get to that point, because the process is so bad in the very first 1 to 2 years that it never even happens, or if it happens, it doesn't give the founders and the team the right support to go and do a big spin out, and so they might default to just sell to a big corporate. They might get the IP, get excited, and the market changes. They need to think about share price, and then suddenly that IP disappears or takes forever to get out in the open. And it gets worse, because if we do exclude, for example, some, let's call them anomalies, like in the Nordics, certain regions of the Nordics, you get certain privileges, for example, as a professor, that allow people in the research to retain the AP from the get-going, and so there's no negotiation, there's no IP that the university can claim, the process is much faster. But if you exclude this 0% equity anomaly, actually the EU is doing terribly compared to the US, and the UK is doing even worse. So the fact that we've managed to create great spin-outs in Europe, including the UK, it's not something that we're like, oh, it's such a great system that we've built so many good spin-outs. No, it's like, founders, you guys have managed to do it so well despite the system, not because of the system, at least, overall. And of course, again, it's a mixed bag. So you might be at certain companies that have been doing it for a while, you might be at some universities that have been doing it for a while, and so the terms tend to be more standard, much lower. And then, of course, you've got other entities that, in some cases also have been doing it for a while, but maybe only focused on one vertical, like, for example, life science historically. And because of that, the requirements and the expectations are a lot harder. And so, again, every time there is a spin-out, you've got founders that have to literally pick up arms and go effectively to war against their own institution. And that is something that, of course, creates challenges. So what are your options? By the way, is anybody here thinking, is thinking of spinning out technologies or working with technologies, or has spun out the technology from either uni or corporates? A couple of people, that's good. What is everybody else doing here? No, I'm joking, but like, okay, so in any case, the path that you might be going through effectively is only a few steps, right? The first thing you need to decide, or the companies you're working with or investing in need to decide, is who owns the IP. That is actually not a straightforward question, because it's not just about the core IP, it's also what the company would eventually commercialize. Now, these are two different things. For instance, if the company is going to commercialize the direct IP per se that is linked to, say, a paper that was produced by, say, a university or a research team at the company, that is one thing. But if you're using research or that IP as a basis to develop more IP, and there might be a ground for it to be substantially different by the time it goes to market, and so you don't want to actually base yourself on patents that have been filed, but on future patents, and you start with a trade secret, well, then in that case, you might not actually need to spin out the original IP. And especially if it's out in the open as published research, there might be cases where your best option is not actually to do a formal spin-out, but to leave and let the terms pass of any agreement you might have, and then actually build a company from the ground up, potentially with the support of accelerators, and that is a choice you've got to make. The reality is that I have invested in companies that do both, and there isn't a very specific reason to do one or the other that is like a blanket answer. There isn't a straightforward answer to that. It's a question of what type of facilities and support you need. So, we run, besides the fund, large tech community, Silicon Roundabout, deeptech network. We've, for example, got a climate hardware event later on today, and the whole community is not just about founders that we invest in, but it's other founders and other universities and research centers. And what we see across the spectrum, not just the founders we invest in, is that it always comes down to one, well, whether the actual IP locks you into a decision, and B, if that's not the case, because like I said, there are ways in which you can interpret and develop more IP, what facilities do you need? Of course, if you're looking to develop a quantum computer, so to speak, and the research center you're starting from has got expertise there, that you might actually want to leverage that. But then in that case, you need to be forward thinking in terms of like, who generates future IP? Is it you, the company, the university you're spinning out from? And that support process, in a way, has to be thought of in advance, because it could lead to potential issues later on, especially when it comes to things like royalties. So, okay, you do your IP, you think the equity is set, if there are royalties provision against future IP development, and say you keep using the labs at the university you're spinning out from, then that might mean that you end up in court. Like recently, you probably read on the FT, if you haven't, you can check it out. There's been a case of a founder challenging the royalties from the University of Oxford, if I don't remember. And this is just never going to really stop unless we have straightforward flat terms across Europe or the UK. That's not going to happen anytime soon, so we need to work with what we have, right? So what are the fundamental tips that we see, again, as having invested in some of these companies, and then, we're going to have more open. It's a workshop at the end of the day after this initial presentation, so I really want us to work on questions that you might have on everything that you've seen so far. Like right now we're just going to go through the core tips that we've seen working when it comes to spinning out a company, because there are now successful companies out there that we've invested in that are thriving, having fully completed the spin-out process. The first one is to validate your idea. And it might sound simple, it might be something that you read on every textbook on startups, whatever, but what I mean here is that you need to think of this process of spinning out as a negotiation, ultimately, right? Whatever, it doesn't matter how supportive the people you're working with are, and it doesn't even matter if you meet a fairly friendly investor or a fairly shitty investor like I might be or anybody else may be. The reality is that it's always going to be a negotiation. And so the more leverage you have in this negotiation, the better you're going to be for your own company. So having a good traction, let's say, in potential, for example, having spoken to some market players, having spoken to some investors that are willing to back the technology, having this sort of support network for the later on type of scenario gives you more power to go back and support your spinning out. This picture, for example, is one of the companies we backed. They build hardware, and in this case, it was a spin-out from a corporate rather than a university. The fact that the founder had investors already lined up, including ourselves and some commercial partners, meant that when the corporate that didn't have too much experience in spinouts, so it's not about necessarily bad behavior, it's just, let's say, not knowing what the market standards are, started with some very high demands on equity. We could actually back the founder saying, well, if we're going to do this for, remember what I showed you here, right? There is a 10 to 15 years time horizon if you don't sell quickly. That could take you to develop the technology. And that means for multiple rounds of funding, for the dilution, and what nobody wants in the game, even people that think they might ignore this part, but really nobody wants the founders, the core team to be disincentivized. Because if you get over diluted, or if your early investors get over diluted, the system doesn't work, right? So part of the game of launching a company, raising money from a company, or investing in a company, or supporting a company is effectively this sort of, sticking your finger out to understand, okay, how much capital do you need? How long is it going to take you to get to a potential exit? What are the potential partners you need? And be also open about different paths, because you don't want to disincentivize players, whether it's the founders, whether it's the early investors. At the same time, the spin-out institution needs to understand that this could be a very long game. Historically in Europe, spin-outs have been happening, but again, historically, they tended to be a way for the tech transfer office to generate some revenue by selling early companies and IPs to come to corporates. Today, there is a thriving startup market, venture capital market in Europe. Still a lot to catch up to the US, but a good market. To the point that you've got US investors like Sequoia, now A16Z, coming to London to open an office for Europe. So Europe is on the scene. It's taking time, we're still got to catch up, but it's on the scene. And in this context, understanding that the IP is something that's going to give value to you, your early investors, and to the organization, it's something that has to be put in the time frame. Okay, well, if this is not just something that we're going to sell as IP in a few months or a couple of years down the line, then the setup has to enable this company to go through multiple rounds of funding, take a long time to commercialize potentially, and through that to potentially even go public, and through that process everybody needs to have a stake in. And so that's how you might need to decide how much equity you give away, whether royalties, even though initially you might say, well, the tech transfer office might say, well, we've built this IP initially, you're commercializing it, we want to charge you 5% royalty on sales. It might seem smart for them, but maybe it's worth pointing out that if you end up closing the companies, there are 0 sales, and 5 or 10 or 20% of 0 is still 0, right? It's important to make genuine projections, and that's why I'm saying validate your idea, because validating by having actual partners that can back you up whenever you have data, whether it's commercial or investor partners, can help you make a much stronger case when you say, actually, it's in your interest not to charge any royalty. It's in your interest to take a 5% stake, not a 40% stake. Because by doing that, you actually enable that 5%, 1% royalty, or whatever it is, to be worth a lot more long term. If you think about the studies I showed before from spinout, FYI, you also see, for example, in the US, and it's something that I don't have on the slides, but in the US, the majority of funding to universities from spinouts doesn't come directly, for instance. It comes from donations. Founders that have become successful, and then they feel this sort of alma mater, this connection to the university, like the Bill Gates or Steve Jobs that go back to have opening speeches at their universities. It's not by chance. So what the US have understood is that if you help companies become extremely successful, the money will eventually come back. It's just going to take a lot longer, but it's going to be a lot bigger, to the point that these universities today actually have some of the biggest endowments funds in the world, and they do it because the people that have become founders and become extremely successful give them back money to manage for the long term. So again, the short-termism, focusing on short-term revenue, might seem like a smart move if you think, oh, I've helped this IP, somebody's commercializing it, I need to have a stake in it. But if you really believe that that IP is worth anything, it's in the long term that you can have an insane amount of value. That's the same reason why I invest in venture capital, right? We're not a bank, we don't write loans, we give you money, take equity, we disappear for a period. But the reality is that we do it because we believe that 5, 2, 3, 7, 10% equity we get out of a company is going to be worth so much more in 7, 8, 10 years down the line. And it's this mindset that universities or corporations that spin out also need to start to get. Effectively, you need to try and help them make the assumption that they are a little bit like a pre-seed investor and have the same mindset that we might have one step down the line, but that same mindset of allowing you to grow to the commercialization stage, so that equity, those potential royalties, I mean, I love people to avoid having royalties, but that's a different story, can be worth a lot more over time. The second tip is protect your intellectual property. Of course, we're talking about commercializing IP. Well, actually, it's great that this talk is sponsored by Michigan Rea, because again, lawyers are actually your friend. I mean, just yesterday I was having a chat with guys at Oric, the day before with a bunch of other firms like MJ Hansen in the UK. Of course, Michigan Rea is a big brand name, startup land. There are so many people you can speak to, and the majority today, then especially in firms that have connections with, say, Silicon Valley and venture capital ecosystem, they are pretty open-minded about being supportive in the early phases. In some cases, not charging or charging very little to then allow you to grow. They, of course, will charge you a lot of money once you get bigger, but the point is that people are starting to understand that startups will never get anywhere if they don't make that first step. And so again, having a good second opinion, third opinion on the actual IP can be helpful. Again, another picture from our portfolio, a company called Vibercore that shows a path that was not exactly a straightforward spin-out. Again, it was an example of a company that could develop further IP from the original IP, and the original IP was mostly public, so that's they didn't need to have a formal spin-out. But of course, once there is something like that, the university will try to at least have a say, and so you need to come prepared to say, well, actually, this is why this is not a traditional spin-out. This is why this IP is developed in-house and is not belonging to the university, even though the starting research was based there. And eventually, if everybody agrees, then at the end of the day, everything is butterflies and unicorns. It's just this phase where, unfortunately, let's put it that way, it is a negotiation, and you need to think about, one, having a stronger hand, knowing the market, having backups for follow-on, and B, having the right legal advice on what actually is the IP that you're commercializing, what needs to be protected, and in this sense, also deciding what should be patented or not. Because if you patent something when you still haven't spun out, then of course the case for the IP being yours is almost nothing, right? You get the support of the university, the TTO, the company to get the patents, provided that's not really the case. Then of course, you're forced to dial down that route. If you use it as a trade secret, you are going to have a low, let's say a weaker negotiation hand with the follow-on investors because you don't have patent already. But it might be worth it if you are thinking that actually you want to build further IP and then only file patents as a company once you spun out. Again, there is always a give and take, right? So it's always a matter of putting all things in front of you and look about the pros and cons and speaking to as many people as possible to effectively decide what's worth it for you, for your case. By giving something, you gain something, and that is the balance you need to try and strike.